tearing away pieces of their life little by little until one day it seems like the hope of a happy future is gone and there's no chance of getting it back. Here at St. Gregory Retreat Centers, we can assure you that there is hope. Our unique approach to recovery begins with the understanding that the dysfunction and damage caused by addiction can be overcome, not just dealt with. Don't let another day go by. Call St. Gregory today.
Whether you're 10, 25, 50, 80 years old and beyond, everyone needs to live within their means. I'm Tom Coates with Consumer Credit of America. For almost a quarter of a century, we've helped people of all ages learn to manage their personal finances to benefit them far into the future. When problems arise, we've got the experience you need to make those debt problems go away. Got financial problems? Call Consumer Credit of America.
If Tom Coates from Consumer Credit of America was your personal webmaster, Tom would filter out all bad debt emails. If Tom was your mailman, you'd never get any debt reduction junk mail. If Tom Coates was a lineman, he'd block any phone calls offering to reduce your credit card debt.
Hi, I'm Tom Coates with Consumer Credit of America, and we're still your best choice for credit counseling. We're local, we're accountable, and we can do more. You make the call when the time's right for you.
When it comes to competition, there really is none for Consumer Credit of America.
From the RE/MAX Real Estate Concept Studios, this is Webcast One Live.
Shalom. Welcome back to Understanding the World with Rabbi David Kaufman. I'm joined in the studio by Mark Finkelstein of the Jewish Federation of Greater Des Moines and by Laura Bellin as well, who's our resident environmental activist who's joining us today so that we have an expert on the environment to interact with Rabbi Arthur Waskow, who is going to be joining us by Skype here in just a moment. I'd like to offer my thanks to Dr. Ronald Bergman for his generous support of our show. Dr. Ronald Bergman is of Bergman Folkers Cosmetic Surgery and Spa, and without his support, we wouldn't be able to do what we're doing and share the wonderful guests and information that we're able to share with you. Rabbi Waskow, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
To join you, shalom and salam.
We have to get our headphones on here so we can hear them. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Salam, peace.
There you are. Now we can see you. I had the wonderful opportunity to be part of the Institute of Jewish Spirituality's rabbinic cohort. I was in the 6th rabbinic cohort recently. And one of the reasons that we do that is because, at least that I did it, is because I felt like I needed to understand more about the spiritual side of Jerusalem, of Judaism, and understand mysticism and neo-Hasidism and kind of the ways to bring that into modern Jewish life and certainly into the life of myself and my congregants. I know that is much of what you are doing in creating the renewal movement. Can you talk a little bit about the Jewish renewal movement and Aleph and all of those things?
Well, beginning about, I guess, 40, maybe even 50 years ago, a graduate, as he calls it, from Lubavitcher Hasidism, Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi, began bringing a renewed and transformed version of Hasidism. Sometimes I ask people if they can get their heads around feminist Hasidism. Mostly they kind of blink and say, wow, no, what on earth could that be? But that's, in some deep sense, what Zalman was bringing. That is a Hasidism which didn't focus only on the Rebbe as a connector to God. One of the deep teachings that Reb Zalman used in his practice that I thought and still think was really wonderful was that he transformed the Rebbe's custom in Lubavitch especially. They would gather in what they called a Farbrengen, let's say on Erev Shabbat, on Friday evening, or the night before a festival. The men, only the men, would gather around a tish, a table. The Rebbe would sit in a big special chair, and he would teach Torah for the next 5, 6, 7 hours. What Zalman did was on an evening before Shabbat or before a Yom Tov, a festival, we would gather, women as well as men, close around the tish. He would sit in the Rebbe's chair, the big special chair. He would teach Torah for about 20 minutes. Then he would say, everybody stand up. And we would stand up. And he would stand up. And he would say, now, everybody move one chair to the left. And somebody new was now sitting in the Rebbe's chair. And he would say to that person, now, look deep inside, find the Rebbe spark in you, and teach us Torah. And then it would move from not just that second person, but a third, a fourth, a seventh, an eighth, a 10th. In other words, what we were looking for was not that Zalman was the Rebbe, but that each of us could be if we reached inside. It was no accident that he thought it was important for us each to sit in the special fancy Rebbe chair, because that would help concentrate the inner sense that we were searching for the spark of Rebbitude, he called it, Rebbeshaft, within ourselves. So that transforms what Hasidism is all about. It still means a direct connection with the Holy One, but it means, first of all, that everybody can make that connection. And secondly, it brought into much wider Jewish circles the sense that all of creation has God within it. All of creation is filled with God. And that has a deep impact on the way we think about a relationship between human beings and the earth.
Now, Lori Bellin, who's joining us, has some questions about the environment. You're talking about relationship between human beings and the earth. Lori, do you want to?
Well, thank you. I'm active in several environmental organizations in Iowa, and as I think about the Jewish responsibility to heal and repair the world, I would be interested in your thoughts about how much am I obligated to just change my own life, for instance, by putting on a sweater in the winter and turning down my thermostat and riding my bicycle more for errands and using a more fuel-efficient car. I could do all of those things, and over the decades, the amount of energy and carbon emissions that I would save might be equivalent to what a coal-fired power plant would emit in less than an hour. So am I obligated to fight on a more systemic level, or is it enough for me just to focus on what I am doing in my own personal space to heal and repair the earth?
Well, I would say yes and yes. That is, of course, the personal act is important, and so is the social act. Let me say a few things, background, you might say, to that. For one thing, from a Jewish standpoint especially, but in general, I'm not so happy about the word environment, literally the word, because what it means is that it's out there in the environs. The Hebrew is Adam for a human being and Adamah for the earth. And when you say Adam and Adamah, you get this. You get intertwinedness. You get the sense that the earth is within us as well as we being within the earth. And you can't talk about the out there because the environment is inside us as well. There's been a lot of biological study just in the last decade that within every human gut, every human intestine in our kishkas are microbes that actually are keeping us alive. They are inside us. So they're not in the environs, but within us. So that Adam Adamah connection is really, for me, a profound teaching just from Hebrew words. Almost you get everything from that. But let me come to your question. We, my wife, Rabbi Phyllis Berman, and I have just finished substituting every light bulb in our house with new LED bulbs. They use far, less electrical energy. And we have signed up for electric producers that are totally from wind energy, that deliver electric power to our house through the networks that already exist, that were created by coal-fired electric power. But now, at least in Pennsylvania, I think in many, many states now, it's obligatory for other producers to be possible. And we have chosen an energy co-op that gets all its energy from wind production inside Pennsylvania. So it's local as well as renewable energy. So that's a step. And we also take part in action to change public policy. So, and I don't think either one is sufficient without the other. And what steps people are ready to take, willing to take about public advocacy, public action, it's, of course, there's a whole set of levels. But I think we're at a moment equivalent to where the United States was in 1960 when the civil rights movement began. There was a deep flaw, a racist flaw in American democracy. And the movement that Dr. King became one of the key leaders of, but not only him, that Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, standing beside King, became one of the leaders of. That movement mended one flaw in American democracy at a crucial moment in our history. Now we are facing a universal, a planetary crisis, even bigger than the crisis in American democracy of the 1960s. Much bigger, because it involves the future of the planet as a whole and of human beings. So when Superstorm Sandy almost certainly made much, much worse than it would have been by what I call global scorching. Global warming seems so pleasant. Just the word warm seems so pleasant. How can global warming be so terrible? But the truth is much closer to global scorching than it is to global warming. So when Superstorm Sandy, which was heated up by the heating of the planet, by global scorching, kills hundreds of people in Haiti and in the United States, in the New York area, the Jersey Shore, etc., and does enormous, enormous damage to the coastline, to the subways of New York, which were flooded, etc. That is a signal to us that we are facing even more serious dangers when you all in the Corn Belt of the United States go through one of maybe the worst drought in the history of the Corn Belt, and now I hear are being flooded with totally unreasonable rain, which is also preventing crops from being planted. When that happens, that's a signal that global scorching is endangering human beings as well as all the other life forms on Earth. So I think that absolutely requires public action as well as personal, household, and community action.
Rabbi Arthur, this is Mark in Des Moines. I have a question that breaks into two parts. Your conception about the infinite and your assumptions about human nature. Reb, do you have a feeling that God literally intervenes in the course of the world?
Depends on what you mean by God. I can tell you what I mean by God.
Well, yes.
I love the name, the Yud-He Vav-He in the Western alphabet, YHWH, name of God. Why do I love it? Well, first of all, I don't think it can be the way people often are taught in comparative religion courses in colleges nowadays. I don't think it's at all Yahweh. It's certainly not Jehovah, because there were never any vowels in it. And I was taught by my grandmother teaching me Hebrew when I was 11, and by 2,000 years worth of rabbis not to even attempt to pronounce the YHWH name, but to use Adonai, Lord, instead. But in the biblical tradition, when Moses stands at the burning bush and the voice says to him, I've got a name now that's really crucial for you to know when you go back into Egypt to say, let our people go. That this name was not Lord. It was, I think, I tried disobeying my grandmother and 2,000 years worth of rabbis. I tried pronouncing YHWH, Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey, with no vowels. And what came out for me was a breath. And the first thing I thought was, well, it makes sense for one of the real names of the real God not to be only in Hebrew, but in Sanskrit and Egyptian and Greek and Latin and English and Russian and Chinese. And breath, breathing, is in every human language. And the second thing I thought was, hey, Waskow, it's not just human languages. Every life form on the planet breathes. And each of us don't breathe just in a little bubble all by ourselves. In fact, we breathe in what the trees breathe out. I'm sitting in a room where I can look all the time at the green faces of God as well as at other human faces. And those faces of God breathing out oxygen make it possible for us to breathe. And then we breathe out the CO2 that makes it possible for them to breathe. So that inter-breathing, the Yud-He, Vav-He, inter-breathing, if for me, that's God. That's the divine breathing spirit of the universe. It's Ruach HaOlam, breath, wind, spirit, not Melech HaOlam, king. And that breath intervenes all the time in our lives. And we intervene in the breath. We have poured much too much CO2, overwhelming the balance of oxygen and CO2 that kept human beings and every life form for the last 65 million years since the great disaster. It opened up life for mammals and ultimately for human beings. But for dinosaurs, it was a disaster when the great asteroid hit the planet and created enormous extinctions. But for 65 million years, we have been living in the midst of this balance of oxygen and CO2. And now the human race in the last 200 years, even the last 50 years, has made it totally imbalanced. So I see what people call the climate crisis, or what I call global scorching. I see it as a crisis in the name of God, in the YHWH name of God, in the interbreathing of the world. So yes, that breathing does intervene in our lives, and we intervene. We are part of that breathing. So we intervene in that divine, sacred interbreathing, Ruach HaOlam, breathing of the world. And that's why it's so important for us, for the sake of human beings, for the sake of life forms on the planet, and for the sake of our vision of God and what we learn of and from and with and in God, for us to act to prevent a climate disaster worse than we've already been facing.
Rabbi, I wanted to ask you about, you touched on it a little bit, talking about the Corn Belt in Iowa. We are blessed with some of the world's most productive farmland. Truly, we have the glaciers bestowed on Iowa, just an incredibly fertile ground, and our climate allows for enough rainfall for crops to grow well. But we have in Iowa, as in many parts of the country, a problem of urban sprawl and cities spreading out, and new buildings and homes being built on some of this amazingly productive farmland. And it results in more carbon emissions for any number of reasons, but it also results in this land being taken out of agricultural production. And I was wondering do you feel that there is a special Jewish responsibility to preserve productive land for the purpose of growing food to feed the population of the earth?
Yes, absolutely. And what's more, the rabbinic tradition, although in many ways it was not nearly as connected to the earth as biblical tradition was, because biblical Judaism really was an indigenous religion, an indigenous people's religion. And we can come back to that, what has happened to that. But in rabbinic tradition, it was clear that, first of all, people clustered in towns, not what we would call big cities, but in towns, that there needed to be, and there was actually rules in rabbinic tradition for green space in and around those towns. And of course, there was a deep tradition of what it meant to be farmers and shepherds. And one of the lines of Talmud that I most love says, you should not raise sheep and goats in the land of Israel, which I love because it seems at first chutzpahdik. I mean, that's what Abraham and Sarah did. That's what Isaac and Rivka, Rebecca did. They raised sheep and goats in the land of Israel. So why did the Talmud say not? Because the number of people had increased so much that they realized if you did that, the sheep and goats would eat up the vegetation of the land of Israel. So they were brave enough, holy chutzpah, spelled H-O-L-Y, chutzpah, as well as the other kind of holy. They were brave enough and chutzpahdik enough to say, we shouldn't in our generation do what Abraham and Sarah did. I think we are at a moment of human history when we need to look around and say, wow, there are 7 billion going on 9 billion of us. We need to redo what it means to be human beings in this planet, not on it, but in it, part of it. And I think part of that is clustering in cities where you don't need to have the kind of transportation that burns the planet, because you can walk, you can bike, you can use mass transit, which is much more efficient in energy use. And you also leave alive farmland and forest land, which is land that actually keeps giving us back oxygen into the atmosphere. So destroying farm and forest land and stretching out where human beings live, so you got to use automobiles to get to them, I think that's profoundly contradictory to what Torah, Judaism teaches.
Rabbi Waskow, in the Institute of Jewish Spirituality, we pay special attention to mindfulness practices, and we deal with that not only in our spiritual lives and interacting, realizing what's going on within our own bodies and our own minds, but obviously dealing with the environment as well. How does mindfulness play a role in Jewish renewal and in your philosophy of social action and environment and all of that?
Well, I think maybe the first practice of mindfulness was Shabbat, the Sabbath, and the sense that on the Sabbath we rest in joy. We don't think of it as, oh, I can't get the work done today that I want to get done. And by the way, I have talked with lots of social activists whose first reaction to being a social activist is, well, the corporations aren't stopping, so I can't stop. I've got to work 7 days a week and maybe, 15 hours a day. And what I've said to those folks is, and I say it out of my own experience, you are very likely to burn out and not be able to be a social activist at all unless you figure out some way of making Shabbat in your life. Maybe it's literally the 25 hours of traditional Jewish Shabbat. Maybe it's some version of that on Friday night and Saturday. Or maybe it is the kind of mindfulness practice that has reawakened in Judaism, partly stimulated by connections with Buddhism. But it was there long ago inside Judaism as well. Taking time, not just on Shabbat, to pause, to breathe.
Okay, Rabbi,
remember that each breath is God's name. Every bracha, every blessing, the blessings over food, the blessing when you see a rainbow, is an opportunity for deep mindfulness. And the teachings of meditation, which have re-entered the tradition in the last 10 or 15 years, they are also ways of mindfulness, as well as the blessings, as well as Shabbat, as well as, if we keep it mindfully, just breathing.
Rabbi, what is your understanding of human nature?
Well, the rabbis talked about, and I think it makes sense, about human beings being drawn by both the Yetzer Hara, the impulse toward evil, and the Yetzer Tov, the impulse toward good. And moreover, they said that even the Yetzer Hara had a creative function to play in human life. For instance, they said that once upon a time, the rabbis hunted for the Yetzer Hara. They actually caught it. They put it in a cage, thinking, well, now everybody will be totally nice. And what happened was that nobody in the land of Israel built a house. Nobody made a marriage. And they realized there was something in the impulse, the sexual impulse, even the impulse of ambition, that was creative and necessary to human life. So they let the Yetzer Hara out of the cage. The question is, how do you infuse the Yetzer Hara with the Yetzer Tov? How do you infuse the impulse toward evil with a drawingness, an impulse, an insistence on using those energies for good? And that, I think, is the nature of human beings. And what we face in the world today is that ambition and greed, which have a place in the world, have turned into our idols, into what we worship. And when we do that, then for sure the planet, as well as human life, gets totally destroyed. There is a reason the tradition said idolatry was a bad idea. And I love the way there's, again, a Talmudic story that I love, in which a Jew goes to one of the rabbis 2,000 years ago, living under the Roman Empire, and says, I just bought a house from a Roman family. And I now realize that in the pool, beautiful, beautiful pool at the back of the house, at the end of the pool, there is a statue, which I suspect is a statue of Venus, the Roman goddess of beauty. So is it an idol? And if it is, do I need to tear it down? So the rabbi says, well, it depends. If the statue was put there to make the pool more beautiful, then it's a beautiful statue, not an idol, and you don't need to tear it down. But if the pool was put there to adorn and worship, celebrate the statue, then it's an idol, and you need to tear it down. So the question is, in our lives, what do we see as something useful, something beautiful, something decent, something full of grace, as part of the great planet, part of our lives, not an idol? We don't carve it out. I think that's what the utterance at Sinai meant. Don't worship the things you carve out. I don't think they're just physical carvings out, but what do we take as part of the flow of our lives, carve it out, and make an idol of it and say, that's the whole thing. Forget about the flow. Whether I have more money, that's the whole thing. Whether I can control the planet, that's the whole thing. Then it's an idol. And I think human nature is about being tugged toward idolatry and saying, oh, wait a minute, that's not really what a good and life-giving life is about.
We're going to take a short break here for a couple minutes. And when we get back, Rabbi Waskow, I'd like to talk about corporate power, which you wanted to talk about today. And I'd also like to get a little bit into your experience with the civil rights movement and what you see as challenges facing us today, and then maybe a little bit of an introduction about what the Shalom Center is about, just so we can touch on that before we run out of time. So we'll take a short break, and then we'll be right back.
From the RE/MAX Real Estate Concept Studios, this is Webcast One Live.
I'm Brian Leach, owner and general manager of Service Legends. I brought along a couple of the home comfort heroes.
Hi, I'm Tammy Wells.
I am Nick Wondershad.
I'm administrative manager.
I am the senior technician
from Service Legends.
It seems like every good thing, when you feel it to the bone that it's good, there's a lot of hard work put behind it. I don't think that you can fake it and have it turn out good.
You know, if we seem like, okay, that's just weird, it's just a furnace, why would you believe so deeply in a furnace? It's not just that, you know, we want to show the world that you can have good service.
Yeah, I mean, it's got to be, it's your home.
You know, it's built into our daily trainings, it's built into our culture, that we're going to do whatever it takes to have each client say they love us, period.
That's why we spend all the hours in the training that we do. And if we guarantee it's going to be a good experience for you, or else it's free, what type of work do you think we're going to do?
There is a guarantee.
Temperature selection guarantee, fixed right or it's free guarantee, comfort guarantee, best value guarantee. All of these guarantees hold us accountable to ensuring that we exceed your expectations. And if for whatever reason we'd fail and we can't make it right, we guarantee all of those guarantees with a 100% money back guarantee.
I mean, if you don't think that your technician can fix it right, are you going to say that to a client? No.
You don't have to worry about having a technician come to your house.
We drug test, background check all of our team members. We put safe people in your home. Each and every one of our service techs, 400 hours a year in training.
You tell it the minute they walk in the door. They know what they're doing, they've done their homework, and they actually truly care about what you want.
Because at the end of the day, you're the person that makes sure I have a job.
They're going to be listening. They're going to want to know what your challenges are. Then they're going to come and give you options, and you get to choose.
If I'm there to help and I make it easy and painless, I did my job right that day.
Well, when it comes to your comfort, safety, and your family, you know, you don't necessarily go buy the most expensive, but you get the most bang for your buck.
Oh, it's worth it, because there's a lot of people that will find a way to get it to work right now and then leave and then come back, charge you again, and the cycle just repeats itself. So when I'm out there looking at the furnace, I want to find why it failed today. How can we change the part today with something that you're not going to have to worry about? Is it worth changing the part today? I mean, you can put a lot of money into a furnace. I can fix parts all day. There's good job security in that for me, but is it the right thing for you?
I get a lot of the phone calls of after the technicians are there. They're just in awe. They're like, wow, you guys are great. I mean, I don't even know what to say. You guys are great. Everything you did was perfect. It was great.
Keep going, though. I like this.
Just give us a try. I'm going to take all the risk.
I've got the time to make this right. I've got the support to make it right.
Just check us out.
And if you don't see the value in what we do,
I mean, fixed right or it's free or 100% money back.
Enough said.
Shalom. Welcome back to Understanding the World with Rabbi David Kaufman. I'm joined in the studio by Mark Finkelstein of the Jewish Federation of Greater Des Moines and by Lori Bellin, who is an environmental activist and political activist here in Des Moines. And we're joined via Skype by Rabbi Arthur Waskow. And Rabbi Waskow, we've been talking about kind of environment and Judaism, and you were talking about idols. And I know you're very interested in talking about corporate power and I think the pharaohs in our lives. And I kind of thought that that's the direction we would go for a second. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. In fact, for me, it's deeply connected with the relationship between human beings and the earth. The story of Pharaoh is fascinating. The cruelty and arrogance and stubbornness of Pharaoh results in what we call the 10 plagues being brought upon the earth. All those plagues are ecological disasters. The water becomes undrinkable. There is a horde of locusts eating up all the crops, unheard of in enormity in ancient Egypt. There are hailstorms, climate disasters, hailstorms, which decimate the land and the people. They're all environmental or ecological disasters. And in my way of thinking about the world and the Torah, they aren't brought on by a kind of super king, Pharaoh, ruler in the sky. They're brought on by the way Pharaoh behaves. If you oppress human beings, as it's clear in the story Pharaoh was doing, it's the earth itself that becomes oppressed and is wounded and, in a sense, rises up out of its wounds, or its wounds are themselves the rising up of the earth. And that's how Pharaoh ultimately is shattered. I imagine many of your viewers, listeners, have seen the film Avatar, which I think is really a film about the Exodus story. In that film, there's a military imperial attempt at conquering a planet. And it's defeated. How is it defeated? The entire life process of that planet rises up against that imperial and military conqueror. Not just the animals, not just the human beings, the trees, the birds, all of life on the planet resists being conquered. And I think that's a modern version of the story of the Exodus. And in that story and in our lives, who is Pharaoh? Pharaoh is irresponsible, unaccountable, centralized power. And I think in our lives, we face big coal, big oil, among others, as the pharaohs in our lives that are bringing plagues upon us. I also think, and given what's going on in the world right this moment, this week, important to notice, sometimes big government becomes pharaoh when it severs the connections with democratic control that we have been so deeply proud of, for good reason, in American society this last couple of 100 years. I think Torah, for instance, has a profound critique of this notion of the NSA hoovering up, vacuuming up all the communications that Americans, millions upon millions, hundreds of millions of Americans speaking on the telephone, sending email messages, all gobbled up by the NSA, the government. There's a wonderful teaching of the rabbis about a wonderful story in Torah. The story where a king named Balak hires a sort of mystical figure, hires him to curse, to hurl curses at the Israelite people who are moving through the land after leaving Egypt as a band of runaway slaves. And Bilam, the guy he hires, gets in touch with the Spirit, with God, and discovers he ain't going to be able to curse the people. He's got to bless them instead. That's what happens to this. He's like a shaman who is in touch with deep spiritual energy. And he says, nothing doing, king. And then he looks at the Israelite encampments and he says, Ma tovu o halecha Yaakov. how delicious are the tents of Jacob. And the rabbi said, so what was so terrific? Ma tovu, what was so good tents? And they say the tents were pitched in such a way that each tent, each family, each household had its privacy. You couldn't look from one tent into the entrance to another tent, and the king could not look inside all the tents because of the way they were pitched. Now that's brilliant. It's, I think, something about the rabbis doing midrash on the biblical story, the rabbis who lived under the boot of the Roman Empire and who didn't like being controlled by an imperial power, which they saw King Balak as a kind of version, older for them even, than the Roman Empire, trying to poke into everybody's life. But what Bilam saw was how wonderful, ma tovu, how wonderful are these tents which you can't penetrate, you can't spy on. The rabbis lived under an empire that sent spies to try to spy on every dissident group that there was. Well, it's really, I think, important for Americans to be clear. Our government does not, should not, must not be allowed to spy on us, to make itself, what has been a democracy, into a pharaoh with a bunch of maybe this is a decent use all that information. But I remember J. Edgar Hoover using the information he could get to blackmail members of Congress and even presidents. And there would be a lot more information available now using the computers than there was to J. Edgar Hoover a generation ago. So I think that's got to stop. That's another kind of pharaoh. But I think big coal and big oil are the most dangerous at this moment because they really are bringing plagues, the plague of global scorching, of Superstorm Sandy, of the drought in the Midwest, and many, many others all around the earth. I've only talked about the ones in America, in the United States, but there are others in Australia, in Russia, in Pakistan. Extreme weather that is almost certainly caused by extreme global to deal with corporate power and government power that's out of control. Rabbi Michael Lerner and Tikkun Magazine have put forth what they call the Environmental and Social Responsibility Amendment to the Constitution. And it's a proposal to put big corporations under democratic control and review of their corporate being, their corporate existence every 5 or maybe 7 years. And I think something like that, I don't know if a constitutional amendment to that effect is necessary or even possible, but what Rabbi Lerner has put forth makes absolutely good sense, and we should be moving in that direction.
I think Laura has a question for you, just to say.
What you were saying about big coal and big oil being like pharaohs really resonated with me, but as you probably know from watching some of the corporate media, there's the corporations turn that idea on their head, and they say, you know, the environmental activists, the ecological activists are oppressing the people who are trying to live paycheck to paycheck. The sustainable food activists want to make your food more expensive. And if we want to have stronger air quality or water quality regulations, that's going to make your appliances more expensive, and it's going to make lots of things more expensive. And so how do we combat this view that in tough economic times, environmental concerns are a luxury that most people just can't afford? We need the cheap electricity from coal. We can't afford to invest in something different.
Well, first of all, there are 14 million Americans who either don't have jobs or have jobs way below what they want, part-time and hanging on by the fingernails jobs, or jobs way below their ability. If we made a decision to create a green economy, those people would have jobs. We would build high-speed railroads. We would do we would build an energy, a solar and wind energy network around the country, so that the places of high sunlight and high wind could send their electricity around the country. We could, in fact, make a green economy in which those folks would have jobs. Secondly, if we were to adopt as congressional law, as American law, what some members of the Senate and House of Representatives have proposed, in fact, a small but bipartisan group, what often is called the carbon fee and dividend proposal, in which we would set a fee for the production of carbon that would increase year by year, so that it would not ruin the economy by being imposed full on at the beginning. It would increase year by year. It would be understood by everybody, so that people would, corporations, businesses, etc., would be prepared for it, and the money that came in from it would be returned to every American. The way in which Alaska now takes the income from the oil companies and returns it to people. We would be able to move step by step out of a carbon economy into a renewable energy economy of wind and sun. And the technology for wind and solar energy has improved enormously in the last decade. If we were giving if we took away the subsidies from big oil and big coal and put them instead for even just the next 5 to 10 years into renewable energy, that the research and the development and the emplacement of wind and solar energy would make it even cheaper than coal and oil are now. And in the process, we would have put people back to work, and we would have stopped poisoning the planet and making a crisis, as I said before, in God's own name. So I just think the arguments against it are like the arguments from the tobacco companies. First they said, well, no such thing that nicotine is addictive. And as it became clearer and clearer that nicotine was addictive, they said, well, it's still economically disastrous to put regulations on tobacco. You're going to ruin North Carolina, where tobacco is grown, etc. Well, they were drug pushers. They were legal drug pushers, but gradually we have learned to regulate them so as to not kill people. That they said was wrong too, that tobacco was killing people with lung cancer, and then they were proved wrong about that. But each time they had some argument against doing what would give people life instead of death. Well, big coal and big oil are drug pushers. They have set up a society in which everybody is addicted to oil. I can't go to make a speech anywhere outside Pennsylvania without taking an airplane. I don't like it. I know the airplanes burn up gasoline at such a rate that they're poisoning the planet even worse than automobiles. But if I'm going to go make the speech, well, you all have figured out a way to do this with Skype, and I should be doing more of that. And I thank you for developing this ability to reach your folks through Skype, so I don't have to fly to Iowa and burn up another hunk of the planet to be involved in a conversation with you. So I don't, but the economic results, it is clear, could be, if we stop listening to and being addicted to the drug lords of big coal and big oil, it is clear we could build a green economy that would be full of joy and would give life instead of death.
Rabbi Waskow, we'll be happy to make the recording of this show available for you, video and podcast, so you can share
Wonderful.
it with your readers all over. I want you to take a moment and tell us a little bit about the Shalom Center and what the Shalom Center is doing, and maybe about some of your peacemaking efforts too, because we only have 5 minutes, so I do want to touch on that and just give you the opportunity to talk a little bit.
Thank you. You have to remember to put that "the" in, because without it, there are other places in the country that call themselves Shalom Center. The shalomcenter.org. So we began in 1983. We're now 30 years old. Kind of amazing in some ways. We began by working on the issue of the nuclear arms race, which in the early 80s was very hot. And we didn't see it as a conventional war and peace question, but as a question of the endangerment of the planet as a whole. Scientists were talking about a nuclear war between the Soviet Union and the United States, creating what they called nuclear winter, that life on the planet would actually end as a result of the explosion of hundreds of nuclear weapons. Well, by God's grace and strange political events, unexpected, in the late 80s, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, in effect, the old version of the nuclear arms race ended. It hasn't totally ended in new versions, but the Soviet-American collision isn't the greatest danger now to the planet. Global scorching is. So we began to move as we saw what was happening in the late 80s and early 90s. We began to move to address this new threat to the planet. We've also been involved in peacemaking. We were the first Jewish voice against the Iraq War, and be a disaster at every level: moral, economic, political, military, every way you could think of. And it was a disaster in all those ways for Americans, not only for Iraq, which it ruined, made 4 million people into refugees and killed somewhere between 100,000 and 1 million Iraqis, but it also killed tens of thousands of Americans. It ruined the American ability to meet our domestic civilian needs by putting so much money into that utterly useless and illegal and immoral war based on lies. So we worked on that, and we actually became a voice inside the Jewish community that gradually convinced other Jews that the war was not only wrong, but needed to be opposed and resisted. And we have worked on issues of war and peace, issues of peacemaking between Israel and Palestine, between Israelis and Palestinians. At this point, this is lower on our priority list because there have emerged serious American Jewish organizations which are working hard on peacemaking between Israel and Palestine. And so we've always seen ourselves as, on the pioneering edge. And it's not yet true that the regular Jewish community has taken on the global scorching climate crisis as a central major issue. There's a lot of paper resolutions and words, but very little from the official organizations to work on this. We have instituted what we're calling the Move Our Money, Protect Our Planet campaign. We've just begun it. And our money protects our planet, maybe even write them down on paper. We didn't plan this ahead of time, but the initials make up Mom and Pop. Move our money, protect our planet. So this was from God. One of the members of our board was jotting down, move our money, protect our planet. as we decided this was going to be our central work for the next several years. And she looked up and said, hey, this actually spells mom and pop. So that's easy to remember. What does it mean? What it means is moving into both Jewish and other religious communities to urge that major pools of money be moved from big coal and big oil to the renewable energy companies, many of which are clearly stable and not about to go out of business, so the money can be put there totally responsibly. That's where we're at now.
Wonderful. Rabbi Waskow, thank you for joining us on our show today. That's we're running a little bit over time, but that's the shalomcenter.org if you want to look up Rabbi Waskow's organization. And I will publish this recording on understandingtheworld.libsyn.com. I'll send you the link for it later on. And it's also on youtube.com/12talk2net. And you can find the recording there as well. Thank you for joining us today. Next week on Understanding the World, we have Jonathan Tobin joining us from Commentary Magazine to talk about Syria and the Middle East. So thank you, and I will see you next week.